Good morning, Earth Science, and welcome back to another video. Today, we're talking about climate and climate change. We're going to talk about what climate is, how the climate is changing, and how it's been changing, and how things have maybe been sped up on that matter. So that's what we're going to jump into today. Okay, the first question we have to ask is, and answer is, what is climate? And climate is an area's long-term pattern of weather. It's not like a day-to-day weather, but it's like the big trends that we see in that area over a long period of time. This can include information about how hot the summers are, how cold the winters are, how much rainfall it gets, how much rainfall it gets during a certain period of year. Is this rainfall gentle rain? Is it thunderstorms? Is it snow? All of these are big defining characteristics of what makes a climate a particular climate. Some more things that affect climate are the number of days and the hours of sunlight. How many hours of sunlight do they get each day? How often do they get that much sunlight? What's the direction, speed, and steadiness of the wind? Is it constant? Is it every spring? When is the wind? Um, the occurrence of severe weather conditions is a great climate description. Do you have thunderstorms? Do you have blizzards? Those kinds of things. The big things controlling climate is latitude, elevation, nearby bodies of water, topography, remember the up and down of an area, and then vegetation that you can find around there. Okay, so temperature. Average temperature helps us determine how hot or cold a climate is. The problem with this is you can have an area that has the same uh, average, but has a very different set of highs and lows. That's what the graph up here shows. You can see that this one is very severe bottom, very high top, but both their averages are going to fall right in this area here. So this is Beijing, China, and Valdivia, Chile, and they have identical averages. But they go from, in Valdivia, the temperatures go from 7 degrees Celsius all the way up to 16 degrees in the summer. And in Beijing, they go from -4 degrees Celsius to 26 degrees. So there's a lot bigger variation in Beijing, even though they have the same average. So this average temperature range is the difference between the hottest and the coldest of the months. That's how that is kind of figured out. Um, so the climate of a location determines on a whole bunch of factors. We call these factors climate control. And the first one is latitude. The closer to the equator you are, the warmer you are. The colder you are, you're probably closer to the poles. So the low pressure of the ITCZ. Remember, this is that big wind stream we talked about, and the mid latitudes have precipitation, and then the poles and hoarse latitudes have little precipitation. So latitude has a big effect on temperature and a small effect on precipitation. Okay, I need to. All right, so on this one, okay, so elevation, temperatures lower at higher elevations because of less air up there. Precipitation, there's also less moisture there. If you're closer to water, large water bodies don't vary a lot in temperature. It takes them a long time to heat up and cool down. So coastal areas around large bodies of water tend to have pretty mild climates. This also adds to the precipitation in the air. So precipitation happens downwind near these really large bodies of water. For ocean currents, warm ocean currents are going to warm nearby coasts, and cold currents, including what we're going to call upwellings, and we're going to talk about those later, cool nearby coasts. And then for precipitation, some of these, especially warm ocean currents, can cause fog. And then topography, where topography is the up and down of an area. If you're on the leeward side of a mountain range, you're going to be warmer than the windward side, and you're going to have that kind of barrier for air masses to move across that mountain. But the same thing for precipitation. The leeward side is going to be drier, and the wetter side is going to be the windward side there. So they also kind of block those air masses trying to go through there. Prevailing wind, remember these are those really strong, steady winds. They determine whether air masses arrive from a hot region or a cold region. Are you always getting your wind from a desert? Are you always getting your wind from a pole or a Arctic area? And then how does that affect your local climate? And for precipitation, they also determine whether or not your air is coming from a wet area or a dry region. Here we're getting a lot of wet air coming over from the Pacific, and that gives us a little bit of rain. If you live over on the Pacific Northwest, you're getting a lot of rain because you're much closer to that action there. And then vegetation affects climate. It affects how much insulation or energy is absorbed by the Earth and how quickly that surface is going to either heat or cool. And then vegetation also releases a lot of water vapor through the air, through transpiration, which can affect the climate by cooling it and adding extra water in there for more humidity. Okay, we're going to jump into what are called climate zones. And the climate zones are things that you've heard of before. They're things like deserts or dry or humid or the tropicals or polar regions. But basically, there are these areas, and then we're going to talk about what kind of weather they usually get. Like in the first one here, the polar has two kind of subclimates. It has tundra and ice cap. In tundra, it's always cold and dry, and they have very short, cool winters. You might see like moose running around here, like upper Alaska. Ice caps, these are freezing temperatures all around. Think Antarctica, think even further up polar into Greenland area. For dry climates, things like deserts and semi-arid, in deserts, it's hot enough that evaporation exceeds precipitation, meaning that it's going to be drier than it ever is wet. And then semi-arid is not as dry as desert, but evaporation still exceeds precipitation. You're still losing a lot of water to the air and to the atmosphere. For humid tropical, there's two kinds. There's tropical wet and dry. Tropical wet, hot and very rainy most of the year. Tropical wet and dry is hot all year, but it has wet and it has dry seasons. So you have this kind of switch between these two things. Okay, some more climate zones here. You have moist mid-latitude with mild winters, and there's a lot of subclimates in here. There's the humid subtropical, there's the marine west coast, and there's the Mediterranean subclimates inside of this one. For the humid subtropical, they're hot, humid summers, mild winters. For marine west coast, it's mild and rainy all year. And for Mediterranean, it's hot, dry summers and mild, rainy winters. The marine west coast and the Mediterranean, you're going to find around bodies of water. Marine west coast is going to be more on the east side of continents. And then your moist mid-latitude with severe winters. It's the same kind of climate here, but the winters are going to be different. And we have humid, continental, and subarctic. So warm summers and cold, snowy winters, and for subarctic, short summers and long, cold, snowy winters. And then highland, they don't have any subclimates, but their temperature and precipitation vary greatly depending on the latitude and elevation. And these are in our mountainous regions where we have lots of up and down in our topography. You're going to see these highland kind of climates going on there. All right, we're going to break into some of these. For polar climates, they're very cold. It's kind of their defining factor. During winter, they have very little sunlight. And during summer, the sun hits Earth's surface at a very low angle. And remember that if you have a lower angle, you're producing less energy. And you want it up to that 90 degrees. 90 degrees is the most amount of energy. If you're less than that, you're going to be getting less energy. So most of the sunlight here that hits is hitting very softly, and then it's bouncing back into space because the snow and ice is very reflective. Dry climates, these are about 30% of Earth's land surface. This is when we lose more water to evaporation than it's receiving as precipitation. So this area happens to happen a lot on the leeward side of mountain ranges. You have here on the Andes and the Rockies. You have these big desert areas on the interiors of continents. And there's two subclimates to dry climates. There's desert and semi-arid. Deserts, they're not always hot or dry, lifeless regions. They can also be cold, especially at winter in the same spot or at night. And they're home to plants that we usually refer to as succulents, ones that are really good at storing water inside of them. It's either roots, stems, or leaves. The next one we're going to talk about are the humid tropical climates. These areas are very hot year-round. They're close to the equator and in the intertropical convergence zone there, which means they have a lot of precipitation falling as these two kind of air fronts are meeting each other pretty much all the time. There's two subclimates. There's tropical wet climate and there's tropical wet and dry climate. Tropical wet climates, this is what you think of when you think of rainforests. They're closest to the equator. They have precipitation most or all of the years. About 10% of Earth's mass is these guys, and they contain the greatest diversity of plant and animal life. They have lots and lots of trees and mushrooms and animals and small plants growing in these areas. A little bit further away from the equator, you have the tropical wet and dry climates. These have a wet summer and a dry winter, and these seasons are caused by this migration once more of this intertropical convergence zone as it moves north and south. This weather changes from wet summer to dry winter to wet summer to dry winter. And it's home to biomes such as savannas and grasslands, things that have occasional trees, a lot of grasses. For our moist mid-latitude climates, we have the mild winters, which include the marine west coast, the Mediterranean, the humid subtropical that we kind of talked about before, and we have the ones that are the severe winters, things like humid continental climate and subarctic climate. For our mild winters, these are things that have hot, muggy summers and then mild winters. Very, very common thunderstorms in the summer. Maybe the occasional frost, but usually stays above freezing even in the winter. Versus the mid-latitude severe winters. In these ones, you often have snow covering the ground in the winter, yet summers are warm enough for trees. These are found mostly on the interior continents and on the eastern coasts of most continents. These temperatures can be very cold because there's no large bodies of water to regulate the temperature because we're usually inland a little bit. And then highlands. These are these mountainous regions that have several climates in a small area. You go from a really, really warm, nice, moist valley all the way up to a really cold, dry mountaintop. So these very variable areas of climate. We refer to them as highlands. So you have multiple climates inside of this very small area. All right, the last topic we're going to talk about is climate change. We know that Earth's climate is constantly changing. The research that we have done suggests that small changes in global conditions can trigger larger scale climate changes. So global mean temperature was cooler at one point in time, right around the Carboniferous period. It was about 5 degrees colder than today. This was due to the extra oxygen in the atmosphere, and it caused a series of ice ages that we're familiar with. So just 5 degrees of cold or hot can really, really make a huge difference. So some causes of climate change. The climate change of Earth relies on our heat budget. So at any point in time, our heat budget is being affected by how much sunlight is hitting the Earth, how much the Earth is absorbing, and then how much the Earth is reflecting back to space. So if more sunlight is being reflected, like say off of oxygen or clouds or ice, then Earth is going to cool. If it's going to be more absorbed, say larger amounts of black asphalt areas or carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's going to increase. So there's lots of causes that we think that affect climate change, but we're going to cover the most probable, the biggest kind of chunks of that. And the first thing is Earth's motion. So climate change happens over long periods, are probably due to Earth's motion. So the shape of our orbit changes. We either orbit closer to the sun or farther from the sun. This happens every about 100,000 years that this orbit changes. In addition to this, the tilt of Earth right now, we're at like 22.5, but we tilt all the way out to 24.5. We tilt to 22.1. When we're less tilted, we're going to get more sunlight. When we're more tilted, we're going to get less sunlight. And this happens every about 41,000 years that we go between this 22.1 and 24.5 degrees. And then the Earth's axis of rotational precession, or our wobble, think about it at the top as we're moving around the sun, we are spinning. This spin takes about 23,000 years to happen. So we've got lots of different motions of the Earth here, and every time that the Earth is moving, it's affecting how much sunlight is reaching it, at what angle it reaches it, and then how much heat we're getting out of that because of it. So lots of things going on there. The second thing are plate tectonics. We have found tropical fossil plants in Greenland all the way up here by the poles. This tells us that at some time, either Earth was a lot hotter or Greenland was very close to the equator. So these continents moving have a lot of effects on global climate. They affect things like wind patterns, they affect things like ocean currents, and they affect the solar radiation reflected by land and water. Remember, we talked about the poles reflect a lot of light. If all of the land masses around the equator, you're going to be absorbing more sunlight, heating that up more, and creating a lot more hot, air currents. So big effect there on where the continents are and how they affect these global trends. The next topic that affects the climate change is sunspots. These are areas on the sun which produce more energy and heat. They're not permanent spots. They come and they go. They're very transitional. So in periods of Earth's history where we had more sunspots, we were probably receiving more energy and warmer. In periods that there was not as many sunspots on here, we received less energy and we were colder during that time. So another transitional thing that affects the climate here. Volcanoes can affect the climate one of two ways. The first is very small amounts of volcanism will pronounce cooling. That's because these volcanoes eject dust and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. This reacts with water to form acid. The acid doesn't absorb sunlight, it reflects it, and it will cool the Earth. But once these acids fall down into the troposphere, because the stratosphere is much higher, once they fall down into the troposphere, they get washed out by rain, and then this cooling goes away. So this is a very short-term cooling thing going on. But volcanoes can also, over a longer time, actually heat the Earth. So extensive volcanism, like in the time of the dinosaurs, we ended up having long-lasting effects on climate. The warmth of the Cretaceous period is thought to be related to the amount of carbon dioxide ejected directly by volcanoes at the time. This increase in carbon dioxide trapped more sunlight, created more of that greenhouse effect, and increased global temperature. So this picture here is really cool. There's a lot of research that suggests that dinosaurs were living around these very large pools of lava in some parts of their climates. So very cool. And then human effect on climate. We have contributed to levels of CO2 in the atmosphere since the late 1800s. We have kind of data about this. The two biggest processes for increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are deforestation and the burning of fossil fuels. And deforestation, I'll say, hurts twice. It hurts once because you add the CO2 from burning or decomposing the trees to clear out these forest areas, and then also the second part of that is now there's less trees to soak up that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and remove it. So we're increasing the amount of CO2 without any way of getting it back out. The modern measurements of global climate change are only several hundred years old. Like I said, right around 1880s is when we started taking this really good data. So we have to use a lot of what we call indirect evidence for climate change. And this is stuff that because we weren't around, keeping track of things at this point in time, we have to find things that were keeping track of this at the time. Things like seafloor sediments, things like glacier samples, things like tree rings. These processes were affected by the temperature of the time, and so we can kind of track how these processes work and make inferences based on what the temperature looks like. So the first one, seafloor sediments. The seafloor contains shells of microorganisms. These guys shells are very important. These guys lived at the surface of the ocean at one point in time. The number and type that are living at any point in time is dependent on the water temperature. So if you have warmer climate, you're going to have more of these guys. If you have a colder climate, you're going to have less of these guys. By studying and looking through these different layers, we can see, okay, at this point in time, this really cold-loving guy was really prevalent, or this really warm-loving guy was really prevalent. So it had to have been warmer in these years and colder in these ones. And then we use radiometric dating to figure out how old that rock is, and we can tell what that global trend probably looked like at that point in time. Another great tool we have is oxygen isotope studies. We use these to study glacial ice. We have oxygen, and then we have heavy oxygen. During warm periods, more heavy oxygen water is evaporating into the atmosphere, making a higher percentage of it in the atmosphere. This means that when rain happens, it uses this heavy oxygen to form rain and snow, and it has these heavier oxygen isotopes in it in these big layers. So in glaciers, we get this accumulation, and we can tell us Okay, during these years of glacial ice formation, we can tell hundreds and or thousands of years in glacial ice, and then these years were hot, these years were cold, and we can kind of tell how old it is based on how deep in the glacier it is, or versus how close to the top it is. The next one, this is something that you might have already done, is measuring climate change using tree rings. Um, Tree rings or older fossilized trees provide really important and really crucial climate information. We know that each year trees create a new ring. If the rings are closer together, that means that the tree was not growing as fast because of the temperature and the rain were not where the tree wanted it to be, usually low temperature, low rain. Um, and then the thicker apart the rings, the faster that tree is growing, and usually this is because of high temperature and high precipitation. So this tree has everything it needs to be successful, and it grows very fast. We talked about there's other big pieces of evidence for climate change. There are more than this, but some of the other ones for climate change include looking at soil layers, looking at fossils, looking at pollen from trees, um, looking at fossil pollen, looking at corals, looking at fish bones, stalactites, historical documents describing different meteorological and weather events, geological features in sand dunes and the hardened sand dunes, and then glacial sediments. So there's lots of different chunks of evidence for climate change. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I hope you learned something from it, and I'm excited to see you in the next one.